Welcome back to our sixth podcast episode of Mindset Monday. Today, we will be exploring the challenging world of writing with our accomplished, inspiring, and artistic guest speaker. No matter what we do in life, whether it is STEM or making music, writing is an essential skill to improve on. It is often very difficult to have the patience and commitment to write well, but it is certainly not impossible. Our guest speaker, Dr. Heather Treseler, an associate professor of English at Worcester State University, will discuss her personal experience as a writer, creator, and teacher, and improve our mindsets on what it takes to write meaningful work in our life. Welcome, Dr. Heather Treseler. It's an honor to have you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Awesome. So just a little bit about her. So Dr. Heather Treseler received her BA in Comparative Literature from Brown University and as a Presidential Fellow, a PhD in English at the University of Notre Dame. She is currently an Associate Professor of English at Worcester State University. While she works with students and teaches, she has also published beautiful poetry in literary journals. Her poem, In the Apothecary, was nominated for a Pushcart Prize. 2 years later, she was chosen as the emerging poet at the Massachusetts Poetry Festival, where she continues to present. Her essays about post-war American poetry appear in 3 books, and last year she published a book called Parturition. Her passion and commitment to writing inspire our Mindset Monday podcast team. Welcome again, Dr. Heather Treseler.
Thank you, Sachi. It's great to be here.
Awesome. So just to get started with our questions, my first question for you is, what were some milestones in your trajectory on becoming a writer? Could you tell us about some memorable anecdotes about when you knew that you wanted to write?
Sure. So I think one of my very earliest memories dates back to when I was 4 years old, and my father was a high school English teacher, and he brought me to what was actually his last day of teaching. He subsequently began a second career that year. But I remember quite vividly sitting in that classroom and hearing him read a portion of James Joyce's short story, The Dead, which is a very beautiful and very moving story. And the story features, among other things, a snowstorm. And even though it was a pretty hot day in early June, I remember sitting there thinking, I can imagine and feel this snow. And I was kind of transported by the language and shocked by how language could sort of give me a new surrounding of sorts. So I think that's actually my very earliest memory is sort of relates, I guess, to the power of metaphor. And then by the time I was in grade school, I was writing stories. I'm one of 4 children. I have 3 younger siblings. And I think in part writing was a way to finish my sentences because it was a pretty boisterous household. There were lots of people saying lots of different things. And part of me wanted to, in some ways, be alone with my thoughts and have a chance to go places with them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, wow. I think that I loved your story about even talking about the power of metaphor and how it was a great way to finish your thoughts. Sometimes writing things down is such a great way to really to put what you're thinking on paper on something. And so what were some challenges in your formative years, college, grad school? Could you tell us about some of the external and internal barriers, if any, for you that you faced along the way as a woman in the literary world?
Sure. I think one thing for me was that I needed to figure out a way to align my passion and interest in writing and language and stories with something like a profession. And I think I sort of fell into the right path. I'm becoming a literature professor because I still sort of pinch myself that I get to meet with small groups of people and talk intently and seriously about language and stories and writing and things that really mattered to me and hopefully really mattered to them. It's been a very sort of privileged existence in that way, and a very lucky one. I will say that when I was in college, and I'll date myself, I graduated in 2002. So right around the millennium, much was changing in the field of journalism, which was maybe the other path I might have taken if I hadn't studied for literature, for an advanced literature degree. Um, and there were a couple of reasons why I decided not to be a journalist, but one of them was just the internet, of course, was changing everything, and I wasn't exactly sure what a career in that field might entail over the long haul. So um, I opted for essentially a career in education, and I think that was probably the better choice. As I've joked with Dr. Chandra before, um, being a good journalist does involve being a little bit nosy, and I'm not terribly comfortable asking people intrusive questions. So I think being an English professor was a better fit for my own personality.
Heather, could you talk about mentorship? So Isaac Newton said something along the lines of, "We stand on the shoulders of giants." And I think when you were in high school, you studied with Saul Bellow, who I think was teaching at Boston University at the time. And then when you were at Brown, you had Michael Harper as a dedicated mentor. So I was wondering if you could talk about the importance of luminaries and just sort of what they've taught you.
Sure. I think both Saul Bellow, who's a Nobel laureate, and Michael Harper, who's one of, I think, the most distinguished African-American poets of the 20th century, taught a lot through their own example. They were both incredibly independent, very deeply committed writers and literary artists. And I think when we think about the difference between a job and a vocation, or a job and a profession, they both really showed me what a vocation looked like. Really sort of feeling called to do the thing that you're doing, and had over the years, especially with Michael Harper, a series of conversations about what that might look like, what kinds of decisions I might need to make in my life to follow that vocation, and make it sort of defining central part of my life. So I feel incredibly lucky that I got to work with them and know them both, because I think as much as they taught me, and they taught me quite a bit in the classroom and in coursework, I think just seeing how it was they led their lives, I think was ultimately perhaps as strong a lesson as their seminars. But great question.
Beautiful answer. So right now now that you're a working poet, you have mentors like Anthony Walton, and then several friends, and you have a wonderful circle of friends, literary coterie, you could call it almost, that helps you, and you give advice, and they give advice to you on your poems. Do you speak about the importance of peer mentorship or peer advice in the growth of your career?
Sure. I think these collaborative networks or friendships that artists have are incredibly important. There's kind of an idea that comes out of 19th century Romanticism, but is probably actually a bit earlier than that, that the artist is sort of this lonely, inspired, wandering prophet or something, which sounds, for one thing, awfully lonely, but also I think is often just not the case. Most writers need good readers, and I do have a small network of friends with whom I share drafts and sort of ongoing conversation about what we're thinking about, what we're reading, what's intriguing to us. And that kind of ferment, I think, is incredibly important for an artist. It's almost like a musician having a band or another group to have jam sessions with. I mean, I think a lot kind of gets unleashed in those conversations, which kind of feed into the work and also keep it from being keep it from being lonely. It adds a social dimension to what can sometimes feel like a little bit of a solitary sport.
I studied at Oxford for a term in 1997, and there were two literary coteries that were competing around the same time or present, I think in the 1850s or 1860s. But it was J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, someone named Charles Williams that was part of a group called the Inklings, and there was a more famous group of writers at the time. But the more famous group of writers, students, they critiqued each other's work so savagely that none of them became successful, or maybe it's just a correlation, none of them became successful. But the Inklings were actually very supportive of each other's work and encouraged each other. And that really helped them all kind of make the limelight, I would think. So you studied Elizabeth Bishop in college and did your PhD on her. And I know she had Robert Lowell as a friend, and that it sounds like an amazing friendship. Could you talk a bit about Bishop and her work and how she inspired you?
Sure. So some of the things I admired about Bishop's work included her ambidexterity as a writer, and as much as she had a deep knowledge of literature and the classical tradition, and all the things that historically poetry had done. But she was also very much a person of the world who was interested in a wide range of music, from Renaissance harpsichord music to jazz and blues and sort of everything in between. She was very stirred by and interested in modern art. She was friendly with Calder, Alexander Calder, for instance, and many others. So she was able to take, I think she had sort of one ear, as it were, to the literary tradition, but also another ear to all the sort of music of contemporary culture. And I think her best poems showcase both the rigor of her classical training, as it were, and her openness to a wide variety of sources. And I think that lends her work a kind of breadth and depth that has held up over time. And I think that, combined with the way in which she tried, not always successfully, to live her life, which was, I think she aimed to be a very sane person, a very good friend. She really had a gift for friendship, a good teacher. One of her friends, James Merrill, said that she was able to impersonate an ordinary woman. And I think that commitment to a seemingly ordinary life allowed her to be incredibly prolific over many decades. When others of her contemporaries, not to throw stones, were less successful in sort of managing the highs and lows of their art with a long life, as it were.
Yeah, her poems are like jewels, and the surface really kind of glistens. But I think, as you wrote in your essay, One Long Poem, it hides quite a bit. There's really quite a bit underneath the surface. So anyway, I will give it over to Sachi.
Yeah, so wow, it seems like you've had some amazing mentors and peers in your life. And I know that you were also an associate professor and you work with many English students and mentor them yourselves. So, as somebody who is currently in the time of writing all my college essays, it's that summer. What advice do you have for students struggling with their confidence in writing, whether that be college essays or poetry, or all the different types of writing there are?
Sure. I think in some ways, whatever genre you're writing in, whatever occasion you're writing for, there are probably 3 or 4 things to try to keep in mind as just sort of basic habits of mind that will help you write better. The first, I guess we could think of it as the eye, the heart, the gut, and the mind. So the eye, we'll start there. Just observing your physical environment and your world, and trying to bring as much detail and particularity as you can to your writing. So is it just a red wheelbarrow, or is it a wheelbarrow that's the color of a Jersey tomato, trying to give your reader as much accurate and interesting perception as you can. The second, I think, related to the heart, paying attention to what moves you, what stirs your emotions, whether it be bliss or anger or sadness or dejection or anything else that we're subject to, just paying attention to what stirs you, because those are your well springs. That is sort of where you get your psychic energy from. And ultimately, you'll write better about things that you care about. So paying attention to what matters to you is often helpful. The third thing, I think I called it paying attention to your gut. The mid-century poet Frank O'Hara, who, by the way, had a day job. He worked at the Modern Museum of Art in New York. He said that, at a certain point, you just have to go on your nerve. You have to trust your intuition or your hunch about what could be interesting and meaningful to your audience. So I think trusting yourself and being willing to experiment. Samuel Beckett said famously, fail better, allow yourself to make mistakes and quote unquote, and experiment with what you can get on paper. And then the last part, I guess, is paying attention to the refinement of your writing, which kind of comes after, I think, all those processes have happened, which is being willing to take a step back and analytically look at your writing and use the full weight of your intelligence to make it better. This portion of the process can also involve, I think, having a reader or readers who can help you edit your work. So I think those 4 things are generally applicable to most things you might want to write, whether it's a sonnet or a press release or a college essay. And I'm sure there are probably other things that good writers would advise, but those are the things that generally I think have been important to me.
So for those who want to be writers, what are some barriers? You mentioned go on your nerve, but are there real world barriers which make it difficult for people to pursue a writing career? And maybe a second question, or part B, is why people who are wanting to choose an English major, are there, and maybe become an English professor, are there barriers in that line as well?
Sure. So I think when I'm meeting with English majors for the first time, I often try to get a sense of both the kinds of literature and writing that they're interested in studying, but also where they see themselves in 5 or 10 years, what professions attract them. Most law students, at least as of a couple of years ago, most are actually English majors. And English, of course, is fundamental to the practice of law, but also to communications more generally, whether it be journalism or marketing or communications within companies, et cetera. Education, of course, is also a field in which we spend a lot of time working on language and writing. But there's really quite a realm of options. It's not quite like studying for a degree in engineering, in which you are sort of carving a somewhat grooved path. But there is a fair amount of flexibility with what you can do with an English degree, which I think it can be appealing to folks, and is certainly not something to shy away from. I'd also say that increasingly a lot of my English majors are double majors. And English, the study of literature and writing, is a kind of super skill. So if you have a nursing degree and you can write really well, it's going to amplify your progress in your profession and your career. And I think that's generally true for virtually every profession you can choose. So, so in that way, I think it's, can be quite appealing to people who are looking for some sort of career edge in their chosen profession and a way to stand out from the crowd. I'm trying to remember what the second part of
Oh,
your
right. The other question was, what are challenges to being a writer, to to being a poet, to being an essayist, to making fashioning a career as a writer?
Sure. I think probably one of the most important things is finding an audience. And I think that's both in finding someone who can read and respond to your work helpfully, supportively, but also finding venues in which your work can be read and known. So I think if you're aspiring to write, finding places that publish writing that you enjoy reading and where you might want to have your own work appear can be a good first step toward sort of putting those building blocks into place in terms of having goals and having a distinct reader or audience in mind for what you're working on.
Mm-hmm. Perfect.
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. And I know this is kind of adding on to Dr. Chandler's question, but for those who are not future writers, how can a closed textual analysis that's taught in some college English courses help people who may not become writers? And what do your students learn from the practice of writing a structured poem?
Great questions. I think that the challenge of writing within a poetic form, which is to say, not in free verse, although free verse poems have their own rigor, can be rewarding to students because they're learning how to manipulate language with nuance and dexterity and really sort of pushing at the boundaries of their vocabulary, but also paying attention to the musical qualities of language and in poetry, especially the visual qualities of a poem. So in some ways, writing a good poem involves a kind of sculptural perspective, but also a musical one at the same time. But the genre of poetry aside, I think studying literature and writing sort of up close and figuring out what makes this introductory paragraph or the start of this short story so gripping. Why am I so drawn to this language or this story? Figuring out and sort of popping the hood, as it were, and getting into the mechanics of good writing, I think will help you be a better writer, but also a better, closer reader. And I think reading closely and looking at the nuances of language is just a great cognitive skill to have, and one that is almost universally applicable, I think, even in math problems, if they involve words,
That's true. You have to read even for math.
Yes. So I'm told.
Wow, yeah, I know that I always really enjoy going to English classes at my school, and I hope to take lots of them in college, because there's so much depth and discussion that we do, and we even when reading poems or short stories, like you said, there's just so much to work with there, and I love that there's usually not one right opinion or one right answer. It's often a very open discussion, which is definitely something that I think is helpful for the future as well. And I know that you have written some beautiful and award-winning poetry, including Wildlife and Louisiana Requiem. Could you tell us a little bit about these poems and what the inspiration was behind them?
Sure. First of all, Sachi, thank you for reading them. I'll start with Wildlife because that won a prize recently, which is always nice to hear or have happen. But that poem was actually a poem I wrote during the pandemic. So like many folks, I think when the pandemic started and traffic abated, all of the sort of wildlife that's just in suburban New England kind of came to the fore. And so there was a kind of gang of wild turkeys that was strutting down literally the middle of my suburban street. And I was very intrigued, of course, by this occurrence. And they were also pretty noisy. As their mating season approached, there was a lot of gobbling going on and a lot of fanning of feathers. And I found myself really intrigued by the turkey world and started doing a lot of reading about turkeys, trying to understand what was going on. And somehow that coincided, I think, with the lead up to the 2020 presidential election, which had its own rhetorical parades and displays and gobbling. And those two things kind of synced in my head. And I wrote a piece that was sort of looking at those two things together. So that was the inspiration for that poem. And then for the other poem, Louisiana Requiem, that was actually, based on a true story. A very good friend of mine from college was describing to me the experience she had had of both anticipating the birth of her first daughter at literally the same time that her mother was in hospice at home for advanced cancer. And so the conjunction of those two life processes and what my friend was experiencing basically in attending to both at the same time was just a kind of remarkable and very moving and poignant thing to think about, and something that so much of us have some familiarity with and at one point or another. And so when she told me about that summer in which these two things were happening, I was incredibly moved and sort of actually thought to myself, oh, that's a poem. But it took probably about a year or so before I could figure out how to start the poem. And sometimes it takes me a while. I just have to wait for the first line or the entry point to occur to me. And once I have that, I can kind of find my way into the material, at least provisionally. So two very different poems and very different sources of inspiration. But I do think that being a writer or a poet, I guess, is paying attention to whatever catches your interest, whether it's what's walking down the street or a story that you hear or whatever else kind of pops up.
Those are beautiful poems. I've read them both. Wildlife sent me scurrying for my dictionary a few times as I tried to look up certain words that I didn't know about the world of tom turkeys. But once I understood what some of the words meant, I thought it was an incredible poem. Louisiana Requiem, I think, is nothing short of a masterpiece. I've heard you recite it a few times, and I'm moved every time. Tells a story of America, tells a story of a person. It's an incredible poem. I also love what you just said about once you get the first line, then you can work with a poem and create one. I've really long pondered the nature of creativity, and I've read accounts. I think with the song "Every Breath You Take," Sting said that he woke up one night in Hawaii and just a chord was going through his head, and he kind of sat down and played it on the piano, and that was sort of the beginning of "Every Breath You Take." And Samuel Taylor Coleridge reported for the poem Kubla Khan that he was in like an opium-induced dream, and when he woke up, he started writing the fragments. Just basically this poetry was in his dream, and he just wrote it down. And then someone came to his door, knocked, and kind of disturbed him, and then he entertained this guest for a bit, and then tried to finish the poem but could not. And so Kubla Khan is subtitled "A Fragment of a Dream." But I loved what you had to say about kind of the entry point. I'm just wondering to what degree writing is inspiration and to what degree writing is craft. Because I assume that you don't get, like you're saying, these poems fully formed in your head and just writing them down. There's no muse that is just giving them to you, and you are just the scribe. So wondering about the balancing inspiration and craft.
Sure, sure. I think writers sometimes talk about the balance between inspiration and perspiration, right? How much work you might put into turning an initial impulse or intuition into something that's like a finished poem. And I will say that I know one poet who's won the National Book Award and some of the best literary prizes that we have to honor our great writers. And it's not unusual for him to work on a poem through 60 drafts. And I think assiduous, obsessive commitment to getting something right is often, for me at least, is more often the case. I've very rarely sat down. I don't think it's actually ever happened in which a poem came to me fully formed. So for me, I would say that if I were to attach numbers to it, that inspiration is maybe about 25 or 30% of the initial engine for the work. But then the work really gets started once you've got that first draft down. Then you've got clay on the table that you can start to try to shape and mold into something recognizable. But that's a wonderful question, Rohit. I think sometimes artists are a little bit disingenuous about how quickly something comes to them. Most of the writers that I know work a lot at getting what is their best work on paper.
It seems like imagination is so crucial. I mean, I just love how you were curious about the Tom Turkeys and, kind of just immersed yourself in their world, read about them, learned about them, and then crafted a poem. I think entering the worlds of other people and other creatures seems really noble and seems exciting in a sense.
Thank you. It was, because I was writing during the pandemic, I wasn't, of course, able to get to the public library safely. So those were, early days. So I was reading a lot about bachelor turkeys, essentially, online. And it was very interesting to see what was starting to pop up in my newsfeed, and ads, things for, animal feed and, farming handbooks and the like. So I think something went askew with the AI algorithm. But more seriously, I do think that just, paying attention to whatever it interests you, however far afield it might seem initially from your neighborhood of knowledge or interest, is not a bad practice to have, because if something interests you keenly, then there's probably something there that will tell you something about yourself, or maybe result in something you can make. So, and now I do know a lot about turkeys. So
in the future, we may have to introduce you as English professor, poet, essayist, turkey farmer.
Oh, yeah. They're not terribly well behaved. So not sure that I'll rush to pursue that calling, but it's always an option. Yes.
Well, this has been a really, really powerful discussion. And as we kind of wrap up here, I just wanted to point out something. I feel like, myself included, I can't speak for everyone, but myself and my peers, everyone's on the phone, staring at a screen. Things are coming super fast to them. It's like quick transactions, and people don't really take the time to be receptive and look outside. And writing things takes time and patience and being receptive. And so, how can our Mindset Monday audience improve the way that they think about their writing and what it means to be a writer? Because it's, we live in a fast world where, people want to do things that are going to be quick and fast and done and check it off the list. Whereas sometimes, like you said, it takes like 60 drafts. It's often really difficult. It takes a long time to write well. So do you have, any practices that have been successful for you to develop this patience with your writing and how to really sit with your ideas?
Oh, Sachi, that's a wonderful question. I think one thing that helps me a lot when I'm working is really sort of sharing drafts with friends, because um, often when I'm in kind of the murk of writing something, uh, if I send it to a friend and that friend just replies benignly with, "Oh, this is interesting," or "I'd like to hear more about what you're talking about in that third paragraph," or something. Um, it provides a kind of, I think, what a psychologist might call a sort of holding environment, right? In which it gives me cognitive time and space to continue working with that material and considering it from another angle or a different angle, and kind of gives me confidence to kind of to stay at it, that there's something there. So I think, you know, not necessarily thinking of writing as um, an entirely solitary process, but one in which it can be dynamic and back and forth, and almost more like a set of correspondences, I think can make the writing process feel more connected to other people, and sort of enhance maybe your patience and letting something develop in its own time. Um, but I agree with you completely that we are creatures of our environments, and I think our phones. I'm not a Luddite by any means. I do have an iPhone and several computers, etc. But I do think paying attention to the ways in which our tools, which we seemingly use, can also begin to shape and fashion us and our attention, and where we put our attention and where we put our kind of hearts and minds. We can't live on clickbait alone, you know. So I think finding things and writing things that are more sustaining is often really good for us, among other things.
Especially when the clickbait is about animal husbandry. So
Yes,
yeah.
yes. I mean, I think it was John Updike who said that that he was characterizing a book of a book of essays he had written about works of art, and he said that writing those essays had been a way to find out what might otherwise just lie inside. That in a lot of ways, you know, I think sometimes I try to push my students to think about writing not so much as the end thought of a process, something to do like a lab report to write up after the experiment has already occurred, but actually as the experiment itself, and as a part of cognition, and as a part of finding out what it is you think, instead of just recording those thoughts. And sometimes I think they find that helpful.
You know, Keats, who described poetry as the veil of soul making, he also, in his poem, When I Have Fears and I May Cease to Be, described fearing that he might die before he got out all the poems, all the thoughts, all the ideas that he wanted to convey, wanted to get across the world. So, you know, that really resonates with me.
Sure. We don't have limitless time. Uh, so but on a more cheerful note, we can make good use of it, and find things that sustain us over time, I think.
So true. Any other final takeaways for our audience as they think about their own writing?
Well, I have some sort of old chestnuts I could roll out, like stay with it. But I do think that you know, one thing that I often try to get my students to do, and that I often hope, especially in my introductory writing classes that students take typically in the first year of college, one of my goals for that course is helping students find a writer and or a subject area that they love reading. Because I think one of the keys to being a good writer is being an avid reader, and finding a writer who really engages you, whether it's a science fictionist or a poet or an essayist or whatever it is sort of the fundamental way you can sort of feed yourself as a writer. So writing is always first reading, I think, and finding out what it is you most like to read will help you be a better crafter of language. So that's what I've got.
Fabulous advice. Well, I am certainly inspired. Thank you for such a genuine discussion on writing and how we think about our writing. I know that once we end this Zoom call, I will be taking what I've learned and applying it and getting on those essays, because I definitely learned a lot today. But this was absolutely amazing. And thank you so much, Dr. Chandler, for your insight as well.
Well, thanks. Yeah, and I loved what Dr. Treseler had to say about networks, about collaboration in writing. That was a true takeaway, that the artist is not solitary, that there's really a lot of collaboration that goes into the craft. So thanks.
Sure. It was great to talk with both of you. I loved your questions and insights too.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much to Ron Trevejo for their amazing editing work.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.